So we have the oil tank completely fit up. We've actually done a little bit of the prep work to the transmission. We have the correct 3 studs removed. We're waiting on a 16-tooth starter clutch. As far as fitting the oil tank, if this were a rigid frame, we would have prepared this bracket, which simply, you'll recognize it, and it bolts to the bottom of the oil tank and then would bolt to the fender. We would drill the 2 holes to match the fender, therefore preserving the stock sheet metal. But in this Duo Glide, we had to construct this lower mount, and there's the 2 uprights and the flat piece. The 2 uprights I had to bend a little bit in the vise together before I put them under there, and then I shortened them each 3/8 of an inch. And then we've tack welded them. You can see also the tab for the primary through here. It was actually not quite long enough. It wasn't light tight, but I was still able to tack it. It also runs a bit of an angle. All these are going to differ. Every machine I've installed a right side starter on has little differences. You can see we have a battery set in there. I've already engineered where the cables are going to run. These oil lines were simple, being flexible. You may have to, for this lower oil line, if it's a hard line, I recommend getting a repop and cutting it here, and then under the transmission, hook it together with a piece of rubber hose. So you've also isolated it from vibration, but that will also allow you to get the rear, because the feed tube is going to be a bit higher than it was from the factory position. You can see the oil drain location here. You might want to consider using a vacuum to remove the oil. Depends on the application. On this side of the machine, you can see maybe, yeah, there's the tack welds I put to hold this tab in position so I can remove the tank, finish the welding, and this customer wants this tank chromed. Under the battery holding the uprights, you can barely see the edge of 2 carriage bolts, the heads of 2 carriage bolts. So we have a smooth surface, and we can put a little rubber pad under the battery. It took 1 inch of spacers under the front. I actually used the 2 spacers that were underneath the original Duo Glide oil tank mount on one side, and the 2 original spacers that were under the front of the plate on the other side. So we have a 1 inch stack of spacers. I had to modify this reproduction electrical box so that the coil mount stud would clear the bolt that's going to hold the oil tank in. Like I said, they're all different, and you need to be a bit of a fabricator to make this work. Now I'm going to be able to remove this tank without mounting the starter system up there. I know there's plenty of clearance, and the reason I know this is that I set a starter housing there and observed the clearance here to the oil tank. It was easily twice as much as this. This is what you're going to have in a typical rigid frame application. And since there was twice that much here in the Duo Glide, I'm no longer concerned about that clearance. You'll notice this is the correct fit of our oil tank in the Duo Glide frame. Very similar to Harley Davidson. It just doesn't fit in the Duo Glide as nicely as it fits in the rigid frame. share with you the details of the final oil tank installation. I like the flexible lines on this machine, but you may have had to deal with hard lines. Shouldn't have been an issue. The feed line position is raised. Don't destroy an original feed line. If you can find a repop that'll thread on the fittings, you'll be lucky, but if you can always split that line underneath the transmission, use a piece of rubber to isolate vibration and help the fit up, because those hard lines are very difficult to bend. The oil tank has been securely mounted and positioned and checked for clearance during our trial installation. We have, in the bottom of the oil tank, used the proper fasteners, carriage bolts, so that we have the round head where the battery sits, and then a pad that I've made here with to clearance around the bolts. The battery will sit on the pad. Also, you see this large zip tie, which is reusable. And once you've cut it to size and use it to hold the battery in the tank, you can use your pocket knife to move this little tab and reuse this as a battery hold down. Now, customers have built others for both the rigid and the swing arm, more elaborate, but this simple, effective, this is the rigid frame bracket. You would still use the carriage bolts to attach this to the bottom of the oil tank. In our case with the Duo Glide, we've attached it to that 3-piece bracket that we fit and fabbed and welded together, and I painted black. This customer wanted the oil tank chromed. So with that being done, we've reinstalled the oil tank securely, and now let's talk about the electrical. I'm using these heavy 4-gauge cables. I built a heavy 10-gauge harness, a 2-wire harness. If you look carefully, you'll see the red wire attached to the solenoid. And if we look underneath, maybe you can see the trigger terminal, and I've heat shrink all the way to the end of the connector. All this is very tight to the transmission. This is where we put a little insulation spot on the top of the transmission with black silicone, just to be extra careful. It so happens they changed the size of the nut on the same brand of starter I've been buying. Good all balls starter. It's now a 12 millimeter. Regardless, this connection is not accessible when the starter motor is positioned where it's going to need to be for the installation. So we want things hooked in advance. This battery cable will come up here and hook along with the circuit breaker. In this case, I prefer a fuse, a waterproof fuse holder, but we have to have something to protect the ignition side of the motorcycle. We've got this big battery, and it's just good sense regardless. On a kickstart bike, it might be in the ground. Move it to the positive side. It's going to make no difference. Protect that circuit. Speaking of the ground, we've got the heavy 4-gauge. I'll confess, the hole is the right size to run a 1/4-20 tap through the hole in the original frame, where the number 10 screw holds the small ground cable. So I tap this hole so that I can easily spin a 1/4-20 bolt in there, in this case with a wing nut. What I've done here is created a way to loosen this up and quickly remove the bolt with my fingers to unhook the ground. It's convenient for maintenance, and I've never had it happen or heard of it happen, but in case the solenoid would stick on the starter, we can easily unhook the ground of the motorcycle. You could attach a little block here, not tap the frame, attach a little block, tap the block, and do the same thing. So the 10-gauge wiring harness that was attached to the XL motor is, here's the termination of it. And this is going to go to a heavy duty 50 amp momentary contact push button switch, marine grade. Usually goes in a 5/8 inch hole. We're going to do it up on around the horn mount on the left side. I don't have the switch here, but you can get on Amazon and buy a 50 or 60 amp momentary contact switch. And that's where these wires lead to. It's always hot because we want to be able to prime the engine before contact, just like we do when we kickstart with our same normal procedures. So the button's always hot. And again, the hot was picked up right off the battery cable on the solenoid. Lastly, highly recommended for convenience is your harness for your tender, your battery tender. Particularly with the electric start. And it's just good common sense with any battery maintenance to have a battery tender, and it's much easier to attach when you have the quick attach harness. Prior to the final installation of the oil tank, you had to weld the tab on that connected to the primary and then have the tank finished. So regardless of paint, powder coat, or chrome, first of all, do not grind any of the welds. That's going to destroy your warranty on this tank, which has been carefully hand built and pressure checked. Secondly, when chroming, polish only the face. Again, don't polish any welds. Also with painting. After the tank is finished, cleanliness is on you. You've got to clean this tank out. Whatever method you decide to use, you have to make sure there are no contaminants in this tank. The oil drain plug is magnetic and in the feed stream, but you are totally responsible for the cleanliness of this tank, the safe installation of the entire right side starter system is your responsibility. And carefully installed, you'll have a trouble-free right side starter for years. A small note here on the wiring harness that you're going to build to hook to the push button switch. I use 10 gauge. You can use 12 gauge at a minimum. The inrush current to the solenoid is up to 40 amps, and that is the ampacity of 12 gauge wire, 40 amps. You may also, if you have the knowledge, put a push button in the handlebars with smaller gauge wire and use a relay. That, of course, is on you.